Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to be addressing the topic of PsyWar, also known as psychological warfare. We're going to be looking very quickly at the foundation of psychological warfare, some entities that would be considered PsyWar actors. We're going to also consider the division of psychology that is typically used in psychological warfare, and that would be social psychology. We're going to look at why it's used in psychological warfare. And necessarily, we are going to draw the distinctions between clinical psychology, social psychology, and psychological operations so that people understand that all of these things are not the same. And there is quite a bit of conflation with respect to this entire dynamic. And so hopefully we will clear up that water. An easy way to conceptualize psychological warfare is the chess game. Now, we're going to talk specifically about clinical psychology when we finish with the rest of the discussion. But right up front, it's important to point out that psychological warfare, in contrast to clinical psychology, is a war on the psyche. And so psychological warfare involves not healing, but actual mind games. While you may hear individuals refer to psychological operations, it's important to keep in mind that not all psychological operations are created equal. There are some psychological operations that are military actions, and then there are some psychological operations that are civilian actions. However, an important thing to make note of is that with respect to the title of psychological operations, that is a military career field specifically. But we are also going to talk about some other psychological operators so that you can get a better idea of the spectrum of psychological operations. And of course, an abbreviation for psychological operations with respect to the military and even some civilian actions. The abbreviation is PSYOP. Now, with respect to the military, there is a motto that goes along with psychological operations. There is also an emblem that goes along with psychological operations, and it is very chess focused. And there are also some themes that go along with psychological operations in the military. However, the theme that goes along with psychological operations in the military is the same theme that is operating with other individuals that are engaged in psychological operations. And so the focus is on persuade, change, and influence. Now, some may recall the earlier conversation where we pointed out that there are divisions in psychology. And so, again, not all psychologists are created equal. They don't do the same things, they don't study the same things, and they don't approach psychology in the same way. Now, with respect to psychological operations, the focus is on what is known as social psychology, and we're going to look at why that is the case. Now, in addition to the military actors, there are a number of other entities that are involved in psychological operations in different forms. And so you have governments in general, governments around the world are involved in psychological operations. You have militaries around the world that are involved in psychological operations. You have various civilian collectives that are involved in psychological operations. There are many political actors that are involved in psychological operations. In fact, politics is just one big psychological operation, quite frankly. And then, in addition to that, there are a number of religious actors that are involved significantly in psychological operations. There are researchers that are involved in psychological operations. What are known now as influencers, they are indeed psychological operators. And then you might encounter psychological operators in your daily walk. So you might encounter individuals who are involved in psychological operations on the job, in your family, your friends, at school, your church. And so individuals who are involved in psychological operations are not limited to those individuals who do that as a profession. Some people operate in this manner when they are not necessarily working in that capacity. It might just be a part of the personality. Now, there is a school specifically dedicated to psychological warfare, and it is known as the United States Army JFK Special Warfare Center and School. And this particular school trains and qualifies U.S. Army psychological operations officers and personnel for the missions to conduct worldwide special operations. And so they are under that big special operations umbrella. Now, with respect to training, they might also be involved in training the various other branches of the service and also civilian personnel with respect to the government. And here are some helpful notations that have been offered. With respect to irregular warfare definitions, the definition given for irregular warfare is a form of warfare where states and non-state actors campaign to assure or coerce states or other groups through indirect, non-attributable, and asymmetric activities. It also provides information related to the Army definition from the field manual. It indicates the overt, clandestine, and covert employment of military and non-military capabilities across multiple domains by state and non-state actors through methods other than military domination of an adversary, either as the primary approach or in concert with conventional warfare. And so psychological warfare in general is considered a form of unconventional warfare. It's warfare that does not require a physical weapon, generally speaking. Now we're just going to quickly go over some additional information related to psychological operations, techniques, and procedures, and this is just a very general overview. Now we're going to look at some of the dynamics that take place with respect to military psychological operations. But again, these dynamics and these practices can apply to those various other entities that have been indicated. And so in this overview, it indicates PSYOPs are planned operations that convey selected information and indicators to foreign target audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The reason why this is specifying foreign entities is because in terms of the military entity, they are not supposed to perform a psychological operation on American citizens. It goes on to indicate that the purpose of the PSYOP is to create in other entities the emotions, attitudes, and desired behaviors that support the achievement of the U.S. national objectives and the military mission. With respect to other entities that engage in psychological operations, it's the same thing, but it's not necessarily related to foreign governments or foreign entities or hostile entities. It can be related to very friendly entities and civilian entities and indeed American citizens. And so part of the function of PSYOP is to influence not only policy and decisions, but also the ability to govern, the ability to command, the will to fight, the will to obey, and the will to support. And so you can see with this that a psychological operation can be readily used with respect to civilian populations and used by those other entities that have been indicated outside of the military context. And so basically, what takes place with a psychological operation, regardless of who is engaging in the operation, is an attempt or a focus on influencing the motives and emotions and reasoning and behaviors of a target. And so there is a focus on essentially changing some aspect of the target based upon the application of these influential dynamics. There's an interesting notation here about PSYOP being one of the oldest weapons in the arsenal of man in terms of combat, in terms of warfare. It also goes on to indicate that one of the functions of PSYOP is to exploit, when possible, ethnic, cultural, religious, or economic differences. Now, what I have also noted with respect to PSYOPs that are not necessarily military PSYOPs, but these civilian PSYOPs with these various collectives, with influencers in particular, is there is an attempt often to exploit either racial differences or sex differences. And this is done to, again, create a particular response. Now, there are a number of strategies that might be used in terms of psychological operations. And some of those strategies with respect to wartime would involve things like using loudspeakers to communicate or dropping leaflets. You might even see leaflet dropping in non-combat situations where a government needs to communicate with the people very quickly. There might also be radio programming and some face-to-face communication. Now, with respect to non-combat situations, you might also see some information pamphlets. You might see television spots. You might see ads on social media at this point. The use of comic books, novelty items, newspaper, and so a heavy use of media. Newspapers, magazines are often used, handbills, posters, and various other forms of communication, various avenues for communicating. Now we're going to look at a few career fields related to psychology. We're going to look at the psychological operations specialists and officers, but then we're also going to look at behavioral health and clinical psychology in the military so that you can see the distinctions in terms of these career fields, and you will also be able to see that they don't really have anything to do with each other. It's not like they go to school together or they train together or they really do anything together. And so you'll see that a little bit more clearly when we go through what's going on with each entity. And so right now we have psychological operations specialists, and this is for the Army. And they were previously in signal and intelligence, but then I did recently see them categorized somewhere else. I'm not sure what that's all about. But the MOS, the military specialty, is 37F. And here's a nice, concise description of the job. It indicates, as a psychological operations specialist, you'll be an expert at persuasion. And so the focus, again, in terms of this career field, is influencing and persuading and changing. It goes on to indicate you'll assess and develop the information needed to influence and engage specific audiences. You'll broadcast important information through various mediums and assist U.S. and foreign governments, militaries, and civilian populations. This is not what a clinical psychologist does. This is not what a behavioral specialist in the military does either, and we'll see that. And here you can see the various certifications and testing requirements for psychological operations. And so there is a period of 20 weeks of one station unit training. There's also a psychological operations assessment and selection program following airborne school. And so, with respect again to behavioral health specialists, there's no requirement to go to airborne school. And so there's also a score that you need to have on the ASVAB in order to qualify as a psychological operations specialist. And we'll see a part of this again when we do this contrast. But it indicates here that the things that they will learn in terms of the training, those things involve intelligence collection, persuasion and influence, and psychological analysis. Okay, and so these are not the things that an individual would be doing in clinical work, and you're going to see that. And here we have the psychological operations officer, which is the 37A. Another interesting notation is that clinical psychology and psychological operations have flipped numbers. And so one is 37 and the other is 73. So that's an interesting notation. And so with respect to the psychological operations officer, this is the commissioned officer that we're talking about now. And so at first we were talking about enlisted members. And so it goes on to indicate a psychological operations officer will be a master of persuasion and influence and an expert in political trends, cultural trends, and attitudes of the people in a given area of operation. The psychological operations officer will utilize understanding of social psychology. What area of psychology? Social psychology. And individual and group dynamics to influence individuals, groups, and populations. And again, we're going to look at social psychology so that you can see why it is the division of psychology that would be utilized in psychological operations versus some of the other divisions of psychology. And so for the psychological operations officer, those individuals have to be U.S. citizens. There's an age requirement, and they go to basic officer leadership school. They have to be eligible for a security clearance at the secret level, and then there is a medical fitness examination and in good moral standing. And for the psychological operations officer, the skills they focus on, the skills they learn are persuasion and influence again, cultural awareness and communications, and social psychology yet again. And this should help to give you some sort of context in terms of where psychological operations fits in terms of the military. And you'll be able to see that it doesn't fit in the area that involves healthcare. It is in its own area and generally related to signal and intelligence. And you can see very clearly the other career fields that are related to psychological operation that support psychological operations and collaborate with psychological operations. So you have public affairs officer, that's a big one, cyber capabilities development officer, radio repair, computer detection systems repair, cyber warfare officer, electromagnetic warfare officer, foreign language specialist. And so all of these go together. And you have some additional careers that go along with psychological operation. You have special forces communications, intelligence analysts, public affairs, mass communication specialists, individuals who would be operating like journalists, in fact, are a part of this collective. Human intelligence collector, cyber network defender, special forces intelligence sergeant, and then signals collection analyst. And again, all of these go together, and you can see how they fit together under that umbrella of signal and intelligence. Now, if you want to see the advertising for the career field of psychological operations, there are 2 videos available that you can check out, and they are referred to as Ghost in the Machine and Ghost in the Machine 2. So now let's look at social psychology as this distinct entity in psychology so that you can have a better understanding of what's going on with respect to psychological operations or psychological warfare. And so with respect to social psychology, just like psychological operations, is involved in studying social influence, social perception, social interaction, and the influences of individuals on group behavior and the influences of groups on individual behavior. And so social psychologists are really looking at people in context, people in social situations. And so social psychologists are often involved in consulting types of roles, but social psychologists don't do individual work with individual clients. That's not something that they do. They don't get licensed in psychology and then practice psychology. They pretty much do research and they teach. And then there are instances where they might be involved in some consulting activities, but generally speaking, that's the parameter for social psychology. Additionally, social psychologists study how individuals think about, influence, and relate to one another. And so you can again see how individuals who are seeking to be influencers in general, not specifically military members, but individuals in general, you can see how they would study social psychology in order to figure out how to influence other people. They look at, in terms of social psychology, they look at dynamics such as prejudice. They look at situations that involve romantic attraction. They definitely focus on the dynamics of persuasion. They look at things like friendship and aggression. And so there is also this focus on emotion and personality. And so you can see why psychological operations would be utilizing social psychology in that work. It goes on to indicate social psychology is the study of how individuals affect and are affected by other people and by their social and physical environments. And so again, this ties into other entities, not just military entities, seeking to influence other people. And I'll just go ahead and use the word that is not being used here. There is also the study of how people are manipulated. Okay. It goes on to indicate the work of social psychologists allows us to have a better grasp of how group dynamics work, essentially, how people make choices, the actions that people take related to their interactions with other people. Social psychologists also look at social perceptions and how social perceptions impact our interactions with other people in the environment. And so you can start to envision how social psychology would be utilized by individuals who would be religious actors or political actors, in addition to these influencers that are rising up. It goes on to indicate that social psychologists study interpersonal and group dynamics and social challenges such as prejudice, implicit bias, bullying, criminal activity, and substance abuse. They research social interactions and the factors that influence them. Okay, so again, there is this heavy focus on influence and studying how people are responding to situations, how people are in context, in group context specifically. And so again, they focus on looking at group behavior, attitudes, public perceptions, and leadership. So, in addition to being researchers, social psychologists are also employed as, again, marketing directors. And so, if someone's looking for a marketing advertising consultant, they would tend to go towards someone who was involved in social psychology. Management, political strategists, and technology designers. And so, again, you can see here pretty clearly that this is a very special area of psychology. And you can also see why individuals who are invested in influencing other people, in manipulating other people, you can see why they would be invested in studying social psychology. It goes on to indicate that social psychologists also work in government and nonprofit organizations, designing and evaluating policy and programs in education, conflict resolution, and environmental protection. Now we're just going to briefly look at some specific areas of study for social psychologists. So now let's just quickly look at some of the things that social psychologists study, some of the things that they specialize in that make them so attractive to entities that are involved in psychological warfare, involved in psychological operations, whether we are talking about military entities or whether we're talking about civilian entities, whether we're talking about collectives or whether we're talking about individuals. Many people, many entities utilize these social psychology dynamics and constructs. And so one of the things that social psychologists study is social cognition. They study social perception and interpersonal behavior. They become experts on culture. They are involved in the area of social psychology and law. They are integral to political psychology, and that's also another very special area. And so they are very much involved in the political arena, or the political arena is very much involved in using social psychology. And so social psychologists are also involved in looking at the formation of attitudes and changing attitudes. And so you can also see why all of this would be useful for individuals in interpersonal relationships that are looking to manipulate and exploit individuals. You see this a lot in social media with various influencers. You also see this with respect to religious entities. Social psychology is also involved in, again, persuasion and influence in terms of research, health behavior change, and so influencing people to do certain things with respect to health, self-control, self and identity, the self-presentation, and conflict. A big area of research for social psychologists is stereotyping and prejudice. And so you'll see a number of social psychologists that are involved in this type of work. And so they become experts on the dynamic of stereotyping and the process of prejudice development. And so they are also interested in intergroup relations. And so how entities are acting towards each other that are in these various groups. And so you could have different groups. You could have different racial groups. You could have different ethnic groups, religious groups, different sexes, different genders. And so you get different political affiliations. And so they look at how groups interact with each other. So not just individuals. So they also look at dyadic social interactions. Those dyads, they also look at triads. They look at groups in general. And strategic social communication. They look at pro-social action. They also look at anti-social action and citizen participation. And again, interpersonal relationships. And so they look at interpersonal relationships, but there is also the use sometimes of psychological warfare in interpersonal relationships. They are also heavily involved in research on emotion, stress and coping, well being, personality, and social behavior. Now, with respect to these influencers, it has been noted that many of them are masters at emotional manipulation, also cognitive manipulation, but very much involved in emotional manipulation and using that to influence entities in the social media sphere to do certain things or to engage other people in a certain way. You see this with some of those gender wars that keep popping up. Those things are not really real in many instances, but there is a manipulation going on in order to make people think that that stuff is real. And it's unclear how the individuals are benefiting from that dynamic, but it is really prevalent. And so, again, these are some of the dynamics that are studied with respect to social psychology that make social psychology so attractive to entities that are seeking to influence other people. Now let's briefly look at clinical psychology as a career field in the military so that you can see the contrast between clinical psychology and social psychology and psychological operations. And so with respect to clinical psychology, it is under a different umbrella. It's under the science and medicine umbrella. It indicates here as a clinical psychologist, they focus on mental health services to soldiers and their families. They learn psychological principles to diagnose, treat, and support patients while directing medical units and conducting vital life-saving research alongside dedicated colleagues in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. And so again, this is not the same as psychological operations that is under that signal and intelligence umbrella. Now, the Army also has a career field for enlisted members versus commissioned officers. And in this particular context, the entity is known as the behavioral health specialist. And again, it's under science and medicine. And here you can see the contrast between the psychological operations specialist and the behavioral health specialist. And so both are enlisted, but again, they are under different umbrellas. And so with respect to the behavioral health specialist, they tend to work under the supervision of a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a social worker. And they often do intake interviews. They might do psychological testing. They might do counseling for patients. They might also engage in group work with individuals and conduct classes to help individuals to deal with various mental health concerns, whether we're talking about interpersonal problems, whether we're talking about drug abuse, whether we're talking about stress that an individual might be experiencing based upon being in the military. And so again, this is not psychological warfare that's going on here with respect to the behavioral health specialist. The focus is on health and healing versus playing mental chess. And here you can see even the testing and certifications are different. It indicates here that there will be 10 weeks of basic training, 20 weeks of advanced individual training, and so basically tech school. However, there is no requirement to be special forces or airborne or anything like that. And here you can see the sister or brother career fields that go along with clinical psychology and behavioral health specialists. And so you see things like orthopedic specialist, biomedical equipment specialist, combat medic specialist, optometrist, preventative medicine specialist. You see nurse anesthesia, patient administrative records specialist, radiology specialist. Again, this is in contrast to signal and intelligence. Other related career fields include endocrinologists, occupational therapists, pharmacists, pathologists, nephrologists, and so basically all of those career fields that you would see in a hospital or in a doctor's office or a clinic. And here you can see this side-by-side contrast for the behavioral health specialist and the psychological operations specialist. And so for the behavioral health specialist under science and medicine, it indicates that they will learn data collection, patient care, and counseling clients and patients. And so that's pretty much a good overview of what goes on with the behavioral health specialist. In contrast, you have under signal and intelligence for the psychological operations specialist, their focus is on intelligence collection, persuasion and influence, and psychological analysis. Now, you might note that psychological analysis is not even indicated for the behavioral health specialist. However, it is a focus for psychological operations specialists. Hopefully, this has provided you with increased clarity regarding the dynamic of psychological warfare or PSYWAR, and specifically psychological operations. Hopefully, you also have a better understanding of the various entities that might utilize psychological operations, even if they are not in the military. And so now you can better see, hopefully, how individuals are using psychological operations or psychological warfare in endeavors such as politics, such as religion, such as research, in interpersonal relationships and context, and very specifically with respect to these social media collectives and influencers. And so they are heavy into the use of psychological operations, but there are various entities that use psychological operations. And so hopefully you have a better sense of that, and also a better sense of how the division of social psychology is playing such a heavy role in terms of psychological operations, how entities can readily use research from social psychology in order to enact these various psychological operations. And finally, with the increasing use of social media, there is an increase in the use of psychological operations. And so you can see it again with various influencers. You can see it with a number of these conflict agents, these agents of chaos in social media. When you see these dynamics where there are gender wars or race wars or ethnic wars, religious wars going on social media, oftentimes these dynamics involve psychological operations. And so, in other words, people are being manipulated. In some instances, people are being manipulated for political purposes. In some instances, individuals are being manipulated for economic purposes. And in some instances, people are being manipulated simply because the individuals who are engaged in the psychological operations are just master manipulators. And so individuals are involved in psychological operations for various reasons. But again, there is a rise in this dynamic going on with respect to social media and with respect to the regular general, what you would call mainstream media. They are also masters at psychological operations, in addition to these various politicians and religious influencers. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care.